SECfans.com week 2, rolling into our second preview this week, doing a little business first. Please remember, some of you new faces, some of you old faces, subscribe below if you like what we're doing. Subscribe below if you hate what we're doing, and comment and tell us what we're doing wrong. We're trying to change things up a little bit in terms of what we're doing, not just game previews, and to be able to get you notifications and get those out there, because you're not going to find them so much in search. You need to be a subscriber. It really helps us out. And just engage in the comments. Tell us how we're crazy. Tell us how we're right. Come back after you find out that we were right or you were right, and let us know about it. All right, South Carolina and Georgia. South Carolina is everybody's sexy pick, not only to maybe upset in the East, but to win this game. Comes out, Georgia is a single-digit point favorite, which probably was... I think that has a little bit more to do with the sexy pick than maybe what these teams are on paper. South Carolina fans killed us in our SEC East preview because we said that Florida might actually end up leapfrogging them this year. One of the things I liked about South Carolina is the same thing when I talked about Texas A&M in our previous. We did Texas A&M and Clemson. If you want to see what we thought about that game, check it out. What we said was A&M last year was struggling with horrible teams. So yes, they played a cupcake to open up the season, but they throttled them, and that's not something they were doing. They were beating Nicholls State by 1 or 2 scores. They were beating the Raging Cajuns. They've been last year, I think 45-21, something crazy. It wasn't a blowout. So we had South Carolina doing some of the same last year, not just losing to a Kentucky team, but also a 1-point win against La Tech. Really struggled against Tennessee, who I considered a cupcake last year. They were terrible. 1-score win over Vanderbilt, Georgia. These are terrible, terrible teams. They struggled with Wofford a little bit at the end of the year. But this year, they kicked the door open to 2018, just blowing the doors off of Coastal. And Jake Bentley was really consistent in this game. I really like that. I love Rico Dowdle. And obviously, the biggest kind of touch point for South Carolina this year is that they get Deebo Samuel back. So before we get into Georgia, I want to talk about South Carolina, and I want to address one of the points that a lot of people have brought up in our SEC East preview, where we weren't as high on South Carolina as maybe South Carolina fans rightfully think that we should be. Deebo Samuel coming back is a really big deal. He's been hurt his entire career, but when he's been on the field, he's been electric and effective. But they also lost some key production offensively and defensively from that team last year. Are South Carolina fans falling into a little bit of a trap of looking at one player coming back to completely change their team and not putting enough weight on the talent and production that they lost out the door from last year?
I definitely think there's a potential argument for that, right? One of the things that tends to happen in college football is we look at the quarterback, the top quarterback, the top running back, the top wide receiver, and we protect the team based off that. There are plenty of examples where a team returned those 3 guys, and so we were convinced they were going to win a national title, and we ignored everyone else. Georgia in 2008 returned those 3 guys, ended up having a good season, but they didn't live up to the number 3 billing. 2 years later, the team that sort of knocked off Georgia in 2008, Alabama returned those top 3 guys, and they ended up with a 3-loss season. And every time there's probably some indication that was going to happen just due to the massive turnover at other spots, but no one pays attention to it because they see the few guys that they know coming back, and they ignore the importance of having returning left tackles and returning starting middle linebackers and right guards and left guards and everything that you have to be a good football team. I don't know if South Carolina is falling into that trap because a lot of the guys they lost, some of them weren't so great, but I do think, and both of us have had this discussion, and a lot of South Carolina fans, I think, responded kind of negatively to our SEC East preview.
Yeah, Hayden Hurst was the one for me that I know everybody's going to look at Sky Moore, and he was somebody I was high on his freshman year. But for me, it's like you replace the loss of Deebo Samuel in the middle of the season last year. You replace him, you plug him back into where you lost him But Hayden Hurst was that comfort blanket, that 3rd and 7 guy that Jake Bentley was finding last year that you lose. And I get it, like there's other next man up and all that, but you're trading one for the other. And I don't know, like we're not talking about a good tight end. We're talking about a guy that went first round. And yes, tight ends are in vogue right now in the NFL, but a first round tight end is a huge producer to lose on this offense. So I don't think it's fair to say, okay, well we're getting this guy back that's really good without considering the fact that this guy
I
worked
agree
out
with
for you.
that, and I think it also extends to the defensive side of the ball. Sky Moore led South Carolina in tackles for 4 years. 4 straight years, Sky Moore was the tackle leader for the University of South Carolina. You do not lose a player like that and not feel it. There's no way. And if you look at the top 2 tacklers from last year, they had 2 guys that were 60 had 62 tackles, tied for the lead. Sky Moore and Chris Lamons. I think Muschamp's done some really good things for recruiting at South Carolina, but if you step back into your objective, you realize that South Carolina's recruiting was not elite in the past few years. And we know some of the guys that are stepping in have experience. You know, Bryson Allen Williams returns, and he was injured a lot in 2017. I get that, but these guys weren't starters for a reason. And when you have some of these guys being replaced by other senior players that never got really significant minutes or weren't major impact players, that brings concern because, and we talk about this a lot. Sometimes I'd rather see, for example, Texas A&M's offensive line that we had a long video and we discussed, getting 3 true freshmen that started in the bowl game, turning around as sophomores. Alabama's receiving core that showed up late in the season, played really well in the national title game. Those guys coming up as sophomores. I have a lot of confidence in the fact that you've got players that beat out people last year for spots. You may improve. If you've got guys that were veterans and have had issues breaking into the roster, I've got a lot less confidence than they're going to be as good as the guys that they were never able to beat out in the past.
One of the things I've liked that you've said all year or this preseason and through week 1 is that you've been consistent in saying, especially to the Miami fans when they complain, hey, we've got all these guys that are next man up. And you point out that yes, they're next man up, but there are guys that were next man up last year when you had all these injuries and Miami got killed. They lost their last 3 games of the season. The inverse of that is kind of true for South Carolina in that they have these wide receivers that played really gelled pretty well as a unit last year when Samuel went down, and they were somewhat proven to be, good in next man up parlance because they were actually winning football games. But one of the things that I will say in Muschamp's favor this year that's kind of plagued him in the past is he's had poor offenses. Everybody knows that. Even back at Florida, he's had poor offenses. But a lot of it is because the offensive line hasn't been there. He's had some running backs at South Carolina, and he had some running backs at Florida that were talented and just couldn't get on track because they didn't have the South Carolina. They didn't have the offensive line that could really support that. I think he's got to. We've talked about Bentley being inconsistent. One of the things that makes your inconsistent quarterback really consistent is a good running game, and I think we're going to see that with the offensive line. But a big but here, they're going to be facing a Georgia team that you talked about the talent gap, potential talent gap with South Carolina and some other teams because they haven't recruited well. They're facing a Georgia team that's recruited lights out. But can we talk a little bit about, and I think this is a fair question. This is an interesting question. South Carolina plays above their recruiting ranking. They play over their heads. We talk about how much production that Georgia is having to replace and having to fill in. Are you more comfortable with, say, a 3 or 4 star guy that's had some time in a system and had some experience and is a returning starter over a 5-star guy or a high 4-star guy who's making the first starts of his career?
That's a tough question. I think generally in a first game, probably for the first 3 games of the season or so, I think I'm going to take the 3-star guy. Honestly, if you've got a guy that has significant experience, starting experience, there's a few examples that come to mind with that. One was Ole Miss in 2014. Ole Miss had a lot of guys that were not really highly rated, not overly talented. They were pretty good players, but Trey Ilston kind of the famous example because there was a play that became a meme where Trent Richardson made the same guy miss twice on the same play by making him miss in the backfield, and then Elston runs all the way down the field and he jukes him again and then scores a touchdown. And in 2014, he turns around and he gets an interception to seal the game over OJ Howard. That kind of shows the difference between a player that's playing as a true freshman without much experience and a player that's playing as a senior, and how if you get a guy like that and he gets a lot of experience and he improves and you're early in the year, they can be, you know, be a darn good player. But, um, you know, in these games too, I think you have some 5-star players who are going to be really good, but they tend to make mistakes. They make coverage busts. They miss gaps, and it doesn't matter how good you are if you're not in the right place at the right time defensively, because especially like corner and safety, if you read something wrong, you give up a touchdown. And you may have great recovery speed, and you may be a lockdown guy, et cetera. But mistakes in the secondary, you can stop somebody, 4 plays in a row and get 2, 3 and outs, and one person blows one assignment and it's an instant touchdown. And especially when you're playing a good quarterback, and we're both kind of on the same page that Bentley is inconsistent, but he's more than capable of making you pay. That can negate 5 or 6 dominant plays due to talent because you make one mental error. They're disproportionately costly. So yeah, I mean, I do think again that 2014 Ole Miss team that wasn't very high on star rankings, but was really experienced. Another example is Auburn's 2010 national title team. They were talented. I mean, they were still Auburn, but that defense had never at any point been particularly good in the years prior. And all of a sudden in 2010, when they were really senior led, they had 1 or 2 pieces, Nick Fairley in particular, that were disruptive, and the rest of the guys just kind of knew their jobs and they never screwed up. And they played defense and waited for Fairley or somebody to make a negative play and stop you. Yeah, I definitely think experience and multi-year starters do trump even really, really talented players. Unless you're really, I mean, Alabama is an example people are going to throw out, and Georgia fans probably think the same way with Smart and what they've been able to do. But that to me is almost unique because you had players that have played in the same defensive system for years. And the only reason that they weren't starting was because they were behind somebody else that was an NFL caliber player. So they
But
marched.
we've also seen at Alabama where, and that's a good example. And I'm glad you brought it up. And I would also argue that 2017 Georgia fits the bill of senior heavy guys playing above maybe their own recruiting rankings because they've been in the system for a long time. But Alabama's a good example because their defensive scheme in particular is kind of complex. But we've seen linebackers get thrust into this scheme and be 5-star city get thrust in when somebody gets injured. Even last year we saw this, and they just look completely lost. Reuben Foster took 3 years before he was remotely the player that he ended up being because he had all the talent in the world, but he was playing super fast, but he was super fast in the wrong direction. So I think there's something to that. But talking about, and we can't, it's not fair to compare last year to this year because the teams are completely different, but I do think it's fair a little bit to look at the fact that if we're going to kill South Carolina for all their struggles, because look, 17-16 over La Tech, it's fair to point that out. 15-9 to Tennessee, it's fair to point that out. Beating Vanderbilt by 1 score that lost 59-0 to Alabama, it's fair to point that out. But on the flip side, it's also fair to point out that they only gave up 24 points to Georgia last year. They held Georgia under 5 yards a carry. I think it's 4.6 yards a carry, and that's with Chubb and Michelle. Jake Fromm had a decent game from an average standpoint, 8.9, but under 200 yards there. And Bentley had some costly interceptions, had some inconsistency there, but he was able to move the ball somewhat against this team. They couldn't run the ball last year. I think that's a decent touch point. If you look at 24-10 last year and you want to have a South Carolina team come into this game with a little bit of confidence, is that something you point to?
I think so. I mean, the fact that you know what you're doing helps. But, and you know this about me, I'm not a huge fan of thinking that the past performance are necessarily an indicator of future results. I think it's easy to fall into that trap because teams, you look at like Alabama, LSU, teams that are good, they tend to have these low scoring, tough games year after year. I don't think that's because they have confidence so much as who and what LSU is and how their scheme is and the fact that that's consistent.
But I think that's kind of what I'm saying though is maybe there's a scheme fit South Carolina defensively that other teams didn't have when they faced Georgia because Georgia was blowing people out of the water, and Alabama LSU is a good example because Alabama struggles with LSU whether the LSU is a 7-win team or an 11-win team. And I think it's because of that scheme fit. So I'm glad you brought it up because you.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's interesting because now you've kind of persuaded me. I was going to the opposite point with this, but and maybe that's the answer, right? Because you said, does confidence matter? And just the fact that, and this is what our channel gets into a lot. That we'll say, no, I don't think confidence really matters, and the fact that they've held them in the past, because I don't think these players lack confidence, and I don't think the emotional swings, and we talk about this a lot. I don't think that's as high and low as people make it out to be. A lot of times, there's other reasons that things are happening. Sometimes it does happen. These are college kids. We get that. We understand it. But I think we have a pretty good track record of showing that stuff's a lot more predictable if you look behind the scenes and the curtain or the scene and see what's kind of going on. In South Carolina's case, Muschamp's style of football, slowing the game down, aggressive defense, usually very sound, very hard-nosed defense, is probably a pretty good match for Georgia's scheme under Smart because it's a pretty straightforward offense. And I think that LSU-Alabama example, now that you pointed out, is probably really apt. That Alabama and LSU struggle with each other because they both know how to play hard-nosed defense and try to win the line of scrimmage. And both those teams are usually used to winning the line of scrimmage offensively, and all of a sudden they can't, and they have a hard time countering.
Yeah, and I think Muschamp defensively reminded me a lot last year, or really since he's been at South Carolina, of that Notre Dame defense that gave Georgia fits early in the season. All right, so I don't want to do the Fromm Fields thing that everybody else is doing, and we touched on it a little bit in our preview, but Fromm's the guy. I think Fields will play a good bit this year, unlike Jalen Hurts, where I think we saw this Jalen Hurts in the Louisville game where the drive chart for Tua was 5 touchdowns and one drive that didn't end in a touchdown because he threw a wonderful pass, converted a first down in the red zone, and the guy fumbled. Every other possession was a touchdown. Jalen came in and I think he had 4 or 5 possessions, and they were all punts and 1 field goal. So that to me is a disruption to your offense where you're almost giving away offensive possessions. I don't think you'll see that with Fields, but I also don't know that right now Georgia's playing anybody that Fromm can't beat. And that maybe tips my hand a little bit on what I think about this game. But look, Fromm, I thought he played admirably against Alabama. He had an opportunity and missed a bad throw on their last possession in regulation that would have maybe put them in a position to win that ball game. But he threw an absolute bomb down the seam that on that stage, like that showed arm talent, vision, ability to place it in coverage. Like he's got a lot of these things that we're always looking to the next guy and we don't see what's in front of us. Fromm's a steady quarterback, but he's not just a game manager. I think he's got some talent there. But do you think if Fromm is the guy and we're settled in here, is he going to be the guy that can step up and carry the team when he doesn't have 2 NFL starting quality running backs getting 300 yards a game for him?
I do think he can, but it's going to depend on how much of a chance they give him to do it. So for Georgia fans that followed our channel last year, they'll know that I was really critical of how little Fromm passed the ball at times. And we had a whole video on whether he was overrated, which I blame you for the title. But my point in that all season really, truly was not that I thought Fromm was an incapable passer. My point was always, I was concerned and disturbed that Georgia was not throwing the ball enough with Fromm and not developing enough of a passing game to be able to execute when they needed to. And to the extent that I said he was, quote, overrated, it was, I felt like his impact in the offense was overrated because he was being asked to do so little. He was he was being asked to be a game manager, and I didn't know if he could be more, but he wasn't even hardly being a game manager. Half the time, uh, he didn't even pass for 15 times in a ball game. I mean, if you go back and look at it, 2017 game log, when you pass for 7 times against Florida or 14 times against Kentucky, 12 times against Mississippi State, 14 times against Vanderbilt, how, how are you even really impacting the game in any way?
And our point in all of that was that it's not that Jake Fromm is overrated, and this was probably fourth, fifth week of the year. It's not that he's not capable. It's that you've got a true freshman quarterback that can win you a lot of games, but at some point, you're going to face a team that takes away the run. And at some point, I don't care how good your running game is, you're going to face a team, if you want to win a national championship, that can take away the run, and you need him to have that kind of experience to be able to go out there and win a game for you. And if you're keeping him on the shelf until that moment, that's a tall order.
Right. And we don't do post game videos or commentary on results. Actually, we used to when we first started, and we kind of reset the channel, but frankly, nobody listened to it. So if people want to hear that, let us know, and maybe we can start doing some stuff. But as it stands right now, it doesn't seem like people are terribly interested in that kind of thing. I think the championship game was pretty telling. And on both points that we're making here, why I said this earlier, and then your original question of whether he can be the guy, Fromm stepped up and was the guy. And it was the first time I felt like I'd ever had a chance to see if he could be the guy. I had never seen him asked to make the kind of throws they were asking him to make in the championship game because Alabama was taking away the run. And he stepped up and he made some clutch throws, and he was converting third downs. It wasn't just a long bomb. He was consistent and accurate. He hit some big crossing patterns that really blew that game open. And I was seriously impressed. And I was impressed because I'd never seen him try to do that. I've never seen him call those plays. I didn't know that he was capable of it. And to be frank, I kind of wondered why they hadn't used him before in that point in the season as a passer.
It's funny because against Oklahoma, they were trying to force it early in that game, and I was pulling my hair out, screaming at the TV because Georgia was running just roughshod over that Oklahoma defense, and you got Michelle, you got Sony and Nick, like it was something like 8 or 9 yards per touch early in the game, and I'm like, why are you throwing so much with Fromm when you don't have to on this stage? And then, like you said, in the Alabama game, even though there was some rushing success, they needed him to step up, and he did.
Well, but I'll say he did until the end of the game. And right in those last couple series, he had a couple misfires. And I think to a certain degree, I don't think he was rattled, but to me, looking at him when there was pressure put on him from Alabama's offense, and for the first time that year, he realized that he was going to have to make throws for them to win that game. I think the moment got to him a little bit. And I think it got to him because they had never asked him to do that. And it's not fair to the kid. And this whole discussion and why I'm making it is I'm now worried a little bit again, on how this is going to go, because Fromm got 16 passes in against Austin Peay. So he's going to go back into this next game with very minimal passes. And you still have to understand that Fromm is a quarterback that in his entire career, the most throws he's made in a game was 32 against Alabama. And before the playoff, he'd only thrown more than 25 passes in a game twice.
Yeah, and people forget this guy's still. I mean, he's a true sophomore. So,
right. And even though he is a sophomore, he's a guy that his first year of starting experience in all those games he started, he was barely used.
And talk about a little bit how if Fields isn't the guy, and I don't think he is, at what point do you shut down the Fields discussion because it becomes a detriment to the progression of your starting quarterback?
Well, and I do think you meant is not the guy, but I think both of us agree we think Fromm's the guy right now.
Right.
And I will add as a quick aside, from what I've seen of Fields and what I saw from the spring game and what I've seen from Austin P, I think Fields is absolutely the real deal. I think there's going to probably be a point where Fields passes from. I don't know that it's now, and I don't know if it's this year because Fromm is a pretty darn good quarterback. But I do think the talent from Fields is exceptional, and that's going to be. It's one of those good problems to have, but it's still a problem things. But I also agree when I say it's a good problem to have, but it's a problem. You have to shut this down at some point, and they're going to have to pick a quarterback. And in large part, it's because last year, quite frankly, in my view, they lost a national title because they failed to develop their quarterback. And you don't want to be in that same boat again. I don't know if you agree with that point, but they're going to have to rely on their quarterback more this year than they did last year. I think that's a given. I know Swift is a very good tailback, but he's not the complete power and speed package that they had in multiple players last year that were all NFL starter caliber backs. They're going to have to throw the ball some. And to do that, they're going to need to develop a quarterback. And to develop a quarterback, you really got to pick one so he gets enough reps in games and in practice to be the guy and carry the offense forward.
Yeah, and I think it depends on what your expectations are. And Georgia fans killed us for this last year, and we kept making the point that you're coming. A lot of the Georgia fan arguments were coming from the point of a team and a fan base that wants to win 10 games. You're judged entirely differently when you are a team and a fan base who wants to win a national championship because you know for all that we say about Fromm in that game against Alabama, let's not forget that they had the luxury of playing Alabama and Jalen Hurts in the first half. That was just 2 quarters of football, and he did have a great throw, and I do think he played very well in the first half as well. But if Alabama and Tua are playing in that first half, then you really have a situation where you got a guy that's going to have to throw it 40 times, 45 times in a track meet. So enough of that. I don't want to rehash that for Georgia fans too much. I do think that this year he will be poised to do that if they can shut down the Fields looking over your shoulder kind of thing, shut it down pretty quickly. I do think they have a ton of talent at running back, but I think it's a disrespect to Sony and Nick to say at their peak of experience, yeah, I do think Nick was a little step slower after the injury, never fully regained it. But at the peak of their experience, before they go off to the NFL, that you've got guys in Swift and Holyfield and the other guys that are going to be better this year. That's just that to me that downplays all the things that they did, and I understand that's kind of the nature of being a fan. You want to do that, and I love DeAndre Swift. I think he's a great tailback, but I think there's going to be a time this season, maybe in this game, where Fromm's got to pass them out of a problem. So, okay, I don't want to get into the predictions quite yet. I still think we need to talk about South Carolina and Georgia a little bit more, but let's get into kind of a little bit of the hypothetical situation and say, what does this game need to look like if South Carolina is going to win it? You mentioned before, and maybe Georgia fans aren't fully familiar with Will Muschamp's style in that he's known to completely shorten a game, which I think is really smart if you're the underdog, to try to shorten the number of lower the number of possessions that the other team's going to have. Do you see that being the case in this game where if South Carolina wins, it's a 17-15 type game and not a 27-30 type game?
Generally, I think that's probably the case. Muschamp historically has liked to shorten games. You know my thoughts on that, positive and negative. The more, just like the more you roll a dice, the more the average roll comes to a 3 or a 4. That the more often you do something, the closer you get to average. It's just basic math. I think the same thing applies in football. And I think it hurt Muschamp a lot of times when he had very talented teams that he shortened games because it gave other teams the chance to win with variability, and they lost some stupid games as a result. But in games like this one where you are the underdog, it helps you, right? You shorten the game and you hit a couple big plays. If you happen to hit them, the other team may not be able to balance it out, right? That one pick six short gives them one less drive, one extra scoring drive for you, and they can outplay you the rest of the game and lose anyway. And we saw that last year with South Carolina, right? I mean, the first few games of the season, we talked quite a bit how South Carolina beat North Carolina State and they beat Missouri, despite statistically being battered in those games. Like outgained, what was it? North Carolina State was 2-1 or 3-1. That's what happens when you play must-champ football and you shorten games. You shorten the number of possessions or reduce the number of possessions in a game. It allows those things to take place. So I do think it helps that you do that. I do think you do shorten the game. I think that style of football helps when you're an underdog, and I think it helps being volatile. And the other aspect, now that we're actually getting into matchups, I think that's interesting, and it's the part we didn't mention on Georgia. Georgia does, as much as they have a lot of guys on offense that are good, you have to kind of be concerned about how much turnover they're having in the back seven. And it's not just turnover. We made this point repeatedly. Last year, I think we talked a lot about how the receiving cores and the returning receiving cores might sort of define the narrative, and I think they quietly did all season. This year, it seems like we have a lot of teams that not only lost players, but they lost players and they're replacing them with a bunch of guys that had never broken into the starting lineup this year. Again, we had sort of similar discussion with South Carolina, but it's true for Georgia. You lose all four starting linebackers. You lose Parrish, who was a guy, I know he got burned in the national title game, but I don't know that Campbell, the 5-star freshman's going to be ready to start. And if he is, it's going to be his first game. By and large, the guys starting for Georgia are all guys that hadn't been able to break into the lineup over the guys behind them. So because of that, volatility becomes more of an issue. You've got guys in pass coverage all over the place for Georgia that are going to be more volatile players. You have a team in South Carolina that is, with Bentley at quarterback and especially with Deebo Samuel, hasn't been a good offense, but they've generated a lot of big plays, and they ended up being a pretty good offense because 65% of the time they've been really mediocre and 35% of the time they just light you up. Put those two things together and there's a potential for Georgia to give up some quote cheap points or easy points early in a game that Will Muschamp's going to shorten. And you sort of see how this all comes together, where South Carolina can pull out a win even though they get outplayed because of the dynamics that factor into this ball game.
If you're a Georgia fan in 2018 and your expectations are revisiting the national championship game and having another shot at it, winning the SEC again, and not taking the step back that we think they might take. And by the way, when we say Georgia takes a step back, we mean 11-1, not 8-4, whatever. What do you want to see in this game? Like, are you, if you're a Georgia fan, if you're the Georgia team, do you need to see a double-digit or a 2-score win, kind of like last year? Do you need to see a 30-20 or a 30-17 kind of win? Or is this a game where you get out alive and you win that 17-16, 17-15, high variability, anything can happen kind of game? You win that game that way. Do you still feel like you're a national championship contender, or do you think we got to win, we got to beat a South Carolina type team 31-17 to still feel good about our team this year?
I don't think they need to pummel South Carolina to prove they could be a national title team. A lot of it's due to what I was saying a minute ago. There's a lot of turnover defensively. They're playing a high variability offense, even though they play kind of old school Neanderthal football. Just because their quarterback is so boom and bust, South Carolina has very high volatility. You just want to see them come out with a win, get some experience, and kind of get things going, and we'll see where they're at in midseason. There are some things I look for them to do. I want to see the passing game have some success for Georgia. Um, Ridley was a good guy coming on. You've got Mecole Hardman. You've got Terry Godwin. There's a lot of pieces there for Georgia's passing game to be pretty good. And like you said earlier, I think Swift is a very good back. But to say that they're going to be just as good or better with Swift, to me, is an insult to how good Chubb and Michelle were. They almost have to take a step back, and they will against really good teams. And they're going to play teams in the playoff probably better than they will, during the season. And they're going to play some teams late in the season, getting LSU and Auburn that are really darn good teams too. So you're going to need the ability to be a dynamic offense. The defense, I think, can be a work in progress, and you can fix that over the course of the year, especially given how awesome the recruiting was last year. You could get one or two freshmen to fill in holes, something Alabama does about every year. Georgia has that kind of class. They can do that. But you've got to get to the point where those guys have experience, and I'm not so concerned at this point how Georgia looks.
All right. So before we get into our actual predictions, how many points do you think South Carolina scores if, as a team, they run for 6 yards of carry?
If South Carolina runs for 6 yards of carry, well, I think if South Carolina runs for 6 yards of carry, something's going extremely well, and you have to think they're going to score a lot of points. And the reason I say that, they didn't average 6 yards of carry last year, so if they run for 6 yards of carry, I don't know how many they score, probably in the 30s, because their offense is clicking at a different level. And I know you kind of knew that when you were asking the question. The reality is South Carolina is probably going to run for 3 or 4 yards of carry and try to find points otherwise, is what they did all last season. It's also why they barely won several games last season. But if they actually are able to run successfully and move the football, which, to be completely clear, is not out of the question given the turnover that Georgia has. We think they'll be pretty good, but we don't know that. Then they're probably going to put up a significant amount of points, especially with Deebo Samuel. They've got weapons.
Yeah, and last year Rico Dowdle didn't play in that game against Georgia, and I think if you're going to catch, this is a particularly favorable time for South Carolina to catch Georgia, kind of like you want to catch Auburn early in the season because their offense is usually just trash early in the year and it gels over time. When you're plugging in new faces and freshman faces, especially on a defense, this is when you want to catch them because I think it raises the potential. So going back to what we know about South Carolina, one of the things you liked about them last year, yes, they are, especially at quarterback, they're a little bit of a question mark in terms of consistency, but the explosiveness was there. And if you're a team that struggles to score points consistently, you want to be able to take advantage of explosive points. And it seems like a pretty good marriage of opportunity for a team that lives on explosiveness and taking advantage of that versus a team that might be defensively mistake prone, where overall they might be a decent unit already, but those rookies, those freshmen, they're going to give up the big play because they're still thinking things through. They're having to think about everything they're doing, especially in the secondary. So is that something that you like for South Carolina in terms of specifically that matchup?
It is, and we talked about this quite a bit. I mean, I like the fact that South Carolina is a volatile offense. It more often than not it bites you, but it can help you. And honestly, this is starting to lead pretty quickly into our actual predictions because if you're the better team, you want to be consistent. That's why Alabama wants consistency. It's why Georgia now wants consistency with Kirby Smart, because if all things play out equal and you both have your average games, you're going to win. If you're not as good a team, then you need to take chances and you need to be volatile, because volatility and chaos helps you. And all those random plays can go your favor, even though you're not as good. And that's how you beat team. You beat the beast. It's how David beats Goliath in college football. So I definitely do think it helps, but frankly, I think it helps because I think South Carolina needs some breaks to win this game.
All right. Well, go ahead and give us your prediction and let us know if you think they get any of those breaks in there.
So, if you didn't get the clue from there, I do think Georgia wins this game, and I think they win it because, we talked about this a lot in the East preview. South Carolina beat Louisiana Tech by a point last year. They beat Texas. They lost to Texas A&M. They beat Tennessee by 6, a terrible Tennessee team. They beat Vanderbilt by 7, a terrible Vanderbilt team. They beat Florida, who was terrible at the end of the year, by 8. They play a close game against Georgia. They get blown out by Clemson. And it's easy to compare that one game against Georgia last year, but outside of that, they were not a very good team. I think South Carolina brought back a lot of pieces. I think they'd be pretty good. I think it's asking a lot for them to step up as much as people are asking them to this year. And as you know, I think Florida is probably going to step up and end up being the second best team this year because basically how much they underperformed last year. And I don't think South Carolina has the pieces to hold with them. So personally, I have this game 27-10, Georgia over South Carolina. I think Georgia, by and large, kind of controls the game, but it's going to be short. However, I do think it's volatile. I do think South Carolina can absolutely win this game. I have a lot of concerns and questions about Georgia's back seven, but I just don't see the pieces at South Carolina that tell me they're really going to compete. I think they're going to be overwhelmed, and I think Georgia's going to be able to play them straight up and just kind of out talent them. And until I'm proven otherwise, and until I'm proven that South Carolina can replace those pieces, I'm going to go with a team that has more recruiting talent and had a much more consistently good performance last year based off the limited data I have in this game to win it. And I'm going to wait for South Carolina to prove me wrong.
Yeah, I think you made a good point about expectations. It's unfair to put the expectations on the South Carolina team, a team that lost by double digits to Kentucky, a team that barely beat La Tech, a team that should have lost to an awful Michigan team at the end of the year. They won that game to their credit, but barely beating bad teams and having a 9-win season doesn't. There are a lot of different types of teams that win 9 games. And I think South Carolina was one of the poorer end of the spectrum teams that won 9 games. But it was still a good season for that team. But we're talking about a team that is almost to the point where they're reloading like in Alabama in terms of recruiting. I do think playing at Williams-Brice helps. That's a crazy atmosphere. I wish it was a night game. 2:30, 3:30 over there. CBS game is fun, but I do wish that was a night game. I think South Carolina scores more points in this game. I also think Georgia scores more points in this game. I do think that it's the Fromm show, and I feel like they are going to lean on him a little bit more. Give me Georgia 30, South Carolina 23, and I think this will mark sort of Georgia taking a best shot from a good, not great team. And then, having a little bit of opportunity after this game to sort of get some seasoning on the guys that they're plugging in from last year. So it's an early test and then a lot of trash. They don't have another test until mid-October against LSU. Do you think that's crazy? A close one-score type game? Do you think that's out of the question?
I do think it's fair, and I talked about volatility. Again, we talk about this all the time. If you watch Jake Bentley's highlight video on YouTube, he looks fantastic because when he connects on throws, he can make any throw on the field. It's when you actually sit and watch the entirety of the game and you see how many routine throws he misses that you realize why South Carolina is limited. And I think a lot of people, and I don't blame the national media because there's 130 teams in college football and they simply don't have time to watch every snap of every team. Even if they sat down, and I know it's their full-time job, but if they sat down and watched every game start to finish, they could not watch them all in the course of a week. And to me, I think anything from 7 points to 30 is reasonable with South Carolina in this game. It wouldn't shock me if they hardly score. It wouldn't shock me if they score 20. I think, I think it's a dice roll, and I think it could go really bad and really poor. I put it at 10 as kind of an average, and because I thought this game was going to end up being kind of ugly and short. I could see these defenses not really missing the pieces they have and going differently. I don't know. I just feel like this is a really volatile game. But I do think Georgia, by and large, has the edge. That's why I went the way I did. And yeah, I don't think you're crazy. I just think at the end of the day, a win, 15-point win by Georgia is probably the most likely result.
All right, y'all. That's it for our Georgia South Carolina preview. We're gonna do a couple more games, maybe a little bit later than normal. We usually get everything out on Monday, but it's Labor Day weekend, so you get it when you get it. But please remember, comment below. Let us know what you think the score is going to be. It's okay if you disagree with us. South Carolina fans have been calling us crazy for over a year now, so Also remember that I'm actually married to a Carolina grad, and I have to pull for them a lot. So I'm not totally hating on you guys. But let us know in the comments what you think what your prediction for the score is going to be. Also, let us know how much you think Justin Fields will play, if at all. So thanks so much, y'all, for another great one. God bless. Have a great week.